The Pavilion on the Links by Robert Louis Stevenson. Part 7. The recollection of that afternoon will always be graven on my mind. Northermore and I were persuaded that an attack was imminent, and if it had been in our power to alter in any way the order of events, that power would have been used to precipitate rather than delay the critical moment. The worst was to be anticipated, yet we could conceive no extremity so miserable as the suspense we were now suffering. I have never been an eager, though always a great reader, but I never knew books so insipid as those which I took up and cast aside that afternoon in the Pavilion. Even talk became impossible as the hours went on. One or other was always listening for some sound, or peering from an upstairs window over the links. And yet not a sign indicated the presence of our foes. We debated over and over again my proposal with regard to the money, and had we been in complete possession of our faculties, I am sure we should have condemned it as unwise, but we were flustered with alarm, grasped at a straw, and determined, although it was as much as advertising Mr. Huddleston's presence in the Pavilion, to carry my proposal into effect. The sum was part in specie, part in bank paper, and part in circular notes payable to the name of James Gregory. We took it out, counted it, enclosed it once more in a dispatch box belonging to Northermore, and prepared a letter in Italian which he tied to the handle. It was signed by both of us under oath, and declared that this was all the money which had escaped the failure of the house of Huddleston. This was perhaps the maddest action ever perpetrated by two persons professing to be sane. Had the dispatch box fallen into other hands than those for which it was intended, we stood criminally convicted on our own written testimony, but, as I have said, we were neither of us in a condition to judge soberly, and had a thirst for action that drove us to do something, right or wrong, rather than endure the agony of waiting. Moreover, as we were both convinced that the hollows of the links were alive with hidden spies upon our movements, we hoped that our appearance with the box might lead to a parley, and perhaps a compromise. It was nearly 3 when we issued from the Pavilion. The rain had taken off, the sun shone quite cheerfully. I had never seen the gulls fly so close about the house or approach so fearlessly to human beings. On the very doorstep one flapped heavily past our heads, and uttered its wild cry in my very ear. "There is an omen for you," said Northermore, who like all freethinkers was much under the influence of superstition. "They think we are already dead." I made some light rejoinder, but it was with half my heart, for the circumstance had impressed me. A yard or two before the gate, on a patch of smooth turf, we set down the dispatch box, and Northermore waved a white handkerchief over his head. Nothing replied. We raised our voices, and cried aloud in Italian that we were there as ambassadors to arrange the quarrel, but the stillness remained unbroken save by the seagulls and the surf. I had a weight at my heart when we desisted, and I saw that even Northermore was unusually pale. He looked over his shoulder nervously, as though he feared that someone had crept between him and the Pavilion door. "By God," he said in a whisper, "this is too much for me." I replied in the same key, "Suppose there shall be none after all." "Look there," he returned, nodding with his head, as though he had been afraid to point. I glanced in the direction indicated, and there, from the northern quarter of the sea-wood, beheld a thin column of smoke rising steadily against the now cloudless sky. "Northermore," I said, we still continued to talk in whispers, "it is not possible to endure this suspense. I prefer death 50 times over. Stay you here to watch the Pavilion. I will go forward and make sure, if I have to walk right into their camp." He looked once again all round him with puckered eyes, and then nodded assentingly to my proposal. My heart beat like a sledge-hammer as I set out, walking rapidly in the direction of the smoke, and though up to that moment I had felt chill and shivering, I was suddenly conscious of a glow of heat all over my body. The ground in this direction was very uneven. 100 men might have lain hidden in as many square yards about my path. But I, who had not practiced the business in vain, chose such routes as cut at the very root of concealment, and, by keeping along the most convenient ridges, commanded several hollows at a time. It was not long before I was rewarded for my caution. coming suddenly onto a man somewhat more elevated than the surrounding hummocks. I saw, not 30 yards away, a man bent almost double, and running as fast as his attitude permitted, along the bottom of a gully. I had dislodged one of the spies from his ambush. As soon as I sighted him, I called loudly both in English and Italian, and he, seeing concealment was no longer possible, straightened himself out, leaped from the gully, and made off as straight as an arrow for the borders of the wood. It was none of my business to pursue. I had learned what I wanted, that we were beleaguered and watched in the pavilion, and I returned at once, and walked as nearly as possible in my old footsteps, to where Northmore awaited me beside the dispatch box. He was even paler than when I had left him, and his voice shook a little. "Could you see what he was like?" he asked. "He kept his back turned," I replied. "Let us get into the house, Frank. I don't think I'm a coward, but I can stand no more of this," he whispered. All was still and sunshiny about the pavilion as we turned to re-enter it. Even the gulls had flown in a wider circuit, and were seen flickering along the beach and sand hills, and this loneliness terrified me more than a regiment under arms. It was not until the door was barricaded that I could draw a full inspiration, and relieve the weight that lay upon my bosom. Northmore and I exchanged a steady glance, and I suppose each made his own reflections on the white and startled aspect of the other. "You were right," I said. "All is over. Shake hands, old man, for the last time." "Yes," replied he, "I will shake hands, for, as sure as I am here, I bear no malice. But remember, if by some impossible accident we should give the slip to these blackguards, I'll take the upper hand of you by fair or foul." "Oh," said I, "you weary me." He seemed hurt, and walked away in silence to the foot of the stairs, where he paused. "You do not understand," said he. "I am not a swindler, and I guard myself, that is all. I may weary you or not, Mr. Custless, I do not care a rush. I speak for my own satisfaction, and not for your amusement. You had better go upstairs and court the girl. For my part, I stay here." "And I stay with you," I returned. "Do you think I would steal a march, even with your permission?" "Frank," he said, smiling, "it's a pity you're an ass, for you have the makings of a man. I think I must be fey today. You cannot irritate me even when you try. Do you know," he continued softly, "I think we are the two most miserable men in England, you and I. We have got on to 30 without wife or child, or so much as a shop to look after, poor, pitiful, lost devils both. And now we clash about a girl. As if there were not several millions in the United Kingdom. Frank, the one who loses his throat, be it you or me, he has my pity. It were better for him, how does the Bible say, that a millstone were hanged about his neck and he were cast into the depth of the sea. Let us take a drink," he concluded suddenly, but without any levity of tone. I was touched by his words, and consented. He sat down on the table in the dining room, and held up a glass of sherry to his eye. "If you beat me, Frank," he said, "I shall take to drink." "What will you do, if it goes the other way?" "God knows," I returned. "Well," said he, "here is a toast in the meantime, Italia irredenta." The remainder of the day was passed in the same dreadful tedium and suspense. I laid the table for dinner, while Northmore and Clara prepared the meal together in the kitchen. I could hear their talk as I went to and fro, and was surprised to find it ran all the time upon myself. Northmore again bracketed us together, and rallied Clara on a choice of husbands, but he continued to speak of me with some feeling, and uttered nothing to my prejudice unless he included himself in the condemnation. This awakened a sense of gratitude in my heart, which combined with the immediateness of our peril to fill my eyes with tears. After all, I thought, and perhaps the thought was laughably vain, we were here 3 very noble human beings to perish in defense of a thieving banker. Before we sat down to table, I looked forth from an upstairs window. The day was beginning to decline, the links were utterly deserted, the dispatch box still lay untouched where we had left it hours before. Mr. Huddleston, in a long yellow dressing-gown, took one end of the table, Clara the other, while Northmore and I faced each other from the sides. The lamp was brightly trimmed, the wine was good, the viands, although mostly cold, excellent of their sort. We seem to have agreed tacitly, all reference to the impending catastrophe was carefully avoided, and, considering our tragic circumstances, we made a merrier party than could have been expected. From time to time, it is true, Northmore or I would rise from table and make a round of the defences, and, on each of these occasions, Mr. Huddleston was recalled to a sense of his tragic predicament, glanced up with ghastly eyes, and bore for an instant on his countenance the stamp of terror. But he hastened to empty his glass, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, and joined again in the conversation. I was astonished at the wit and information he displayed. Mr. Huddleston's was certainly no ordinary character. He had read and observed for himself, his gifts were sound, and, though I could never have learned to love the man, I began to understand his success in business, and the great respect in which he had been held before his failure. He had, above all, the talent of society, and though I never heard him speak but on this one and most unfavourable occasion, I set him down among the most brilliant conversationalists I ever met. He was relating with great gusto, and seemingly no feeling of shame, the manoeuvres of a scoundrelly commission merchant whom he had known and studied in his youth, and we were all listening with an odd mixture of mirth and embarrassment, when our little party was brought abruptly to an end in the most startling manner. A noise like that of a wet finger on the window-pane interrupted Mr. Huddleston's tale, and in an instant we were all four as white as paper, and sat tongue-tied and motionless round the table. "A snail," I said at last, for I had heard that these animals make a noise somewhat similar in character. "Snail bd," said Northmore. "Hush!" The same sound was repeated twice at regular intervals, and then a formidable voice shouted through the shutters the Italian word, traditor. Mr. Huddleston threw his head in the air, his eyelids quivered. Next moment he fell insensible below the table. Northmore and I had each run to the armory and seized a gun. Clara was on her feet with her hand at her throat. So we stood waiting, for we thought the hour of attack was certainly come, but second passed after second, and all but the serf remained silent in the neighbourhood of the pavilion. "Quick," said Northmore, "upstairs with him before they come."